The Circulatory System, Lesson 4.1, Introduction to Circulation. So when you think of the circulatory system, you probably are thinking of the most major part, which is the heart, and you're correct. Its main job is to pump blood throughout the body, and the way it does that is through things like our veins and our arteries. Without our heart, we wouldn't be able to survive because our other organs need that blood. It also helps maintain the body's internal environment, and it's composed of the lymphatic and the circulatory system. So the lymphatic system kind of falls under like the subcategory of the circulatory system, where it just gives it a little bit of extra help to make the full system work. So let's talk a little bit about the lymphatic system first. So essentially what it is it is a network of vessels, nodes, and organs that collect fluid that leaves the capillaries. It filters it, and then it returns it to the circulatory system. So that's why you see they kind of work hand in hand. Lymph is the actual thick liquid that flows through the lymphatic system, and it can be seen as colorless or yellow. So if you ever get, when you're sick or have like strep throat or something, a lymph node, that's what it's essentially filled with, and then oftentimes it just drains through the back. The flow of lymph is one way back to the heart. So there's no pump that controls it. It solely relies on muscle contractions. So when your muscles kind of go in and out, that's how the flow of lymph moves. And then just some fun facts. The largest organ in the lymphatic system is the spleen. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the circulatory system now, which is the main thing that we're going to be focusing on. So in order for something to be classified as a circulatory system, it has to have three components. So first of all, a pump, a fluid that is pumped by that pump, and then vessels where that fluid travels. So let's talk about how a human circulatory system works. So our pump is obviously the heart, right? Because that's the thing that pumps and contracts. The fluid that kind of flows in this pump is, you probably guessed it, it's the blood. And now the vessels where this fluid travels, or the blood travels, is things like the arteries, veins, and the capillaries, which we'll all talk about later. So now we can break it down a little bit. So we have, starting off, the blood. So the average human has actually about 4 to 6 liters of blood. Now when you really think about that, that's a lot of blood. And what blood is it is a suspension of fluids inside cells. Now blood actually has two parts to it. It has a liquid part, and it sort of has a formed elements or sort of a thicker substance sort of part. And the liquid part is what's known as plasma, and that makes up about 55% of our blood. The other 45% of our blood is what's known as blood cells. So when you think of blood cells, you probably are thinking of like red blood cells. And you're absolutely right. Those blood cells are the things that help our body sort of do certain things and protect us against certain things. So there's 3 types of blood cells. The first one are erythrocytes. The second one is leucocytes. And the third one are thrombocytes. And those are sort of the more sciencey names for them, but we'll talk about a little bit about the more common names for them after. So again, we have erythrocytes, or more better known as red blood cells. So red blood cells are made in bone marrow, and they're stored in the spleen. This is the part that's most important. Their primary function is to carry oxygen. So without these, our rest of our organs, or the rest of our body, would not get the oxygen that it needs to function, or it wouldn't get any at all, actually. And so a little fun fact about this is, at the core of hemoglobin is a substance called iron. And what this iron does is it gives blood this bright red color that you see here. So if you cut yourself, you're going to see that your blood is bright red, and that's as a result of the iron in hemoglobin. Next is white blood cells, or leukocytes. Its primary function is to help defend the body against disease. So anytime you have an infection or you're sick, these white blood cells are going to rush to the site of the infection, and they are going to help your body defeat the virus or the infection as fast as possible. And they're also produced in bone marrow, and some stay in one spot while others circulate throughout the body just to make sure that everything is running smoothly. And the last one that we're going to talk about is platelets or thrombocytes. So most people don't actually remember that platelets are a part of our blood cells. They make up a small amount, but they actually are. Cell fragments that are produced in bone marrow make up platelets, and their primary function is that they are responsible for clotting. So anytime you get a cut, these platelets will rush to the site of the cut and start to clot the blood, and to make sure that you don't bleed out, which is actually a very important job. So that what helps it do this is fibrin, and this is formed by the activation of fibrinogen, which are all chemicals that help platelets work. So sometimes when these blood cells don't work correctly or they're not used correctly, some problems can arise. So one of the problems is anemia, and this is a problem that you can develop. So when you don't get enough red blood cells produced, you may begin to feel faint or dizzy because you're not getting enough oxygen circulated. So remember that red blood cells circulate that oxygen. So when you're not being delivered that oxygen to places like your brain or your other organs, you're going to start to feel dizzy or faint. And this happens as a lack of iron. So some people tend to eat things higher in iron or take iron pills to help solve this. Another problem that can arise is shock. So whereas anemia is more of something that you develop, shock is something that happens when you're scared or something happens to your body. So it's a failure of the circulatory system to deliver the oxygen. So your body starts to shut down from this. Another thing that is actually very common in the athletic world is called blood doping. So when Olympic athletes do this, they want to increase their red blood cells because remember, red blood cells give us oxygen, and in order for our muscles to work, they need oxygen. So they are injecting themselves with red blood cells so that their muscles can work harder because they have more oxygen compared to their competitors that they're competing against. And so when this is injected, they're injecting themselves with red blood cells. And this can be very harmful in the future because you don't want to have your body injected with this many red blood cells. And it can lead to all sorts of problems, just like some of the ones listed below, which are just some problems of the circulatory system in general. So a heart attack, an aneurysm, an arrhythmia, which is like an irregular heartbeat, high blood pressure, or CHD, which is chronic heart disease, which is something that you're born with. Now let's talk about the most important part of the circulatory system, the heart. So it's a muscle organ that pumps blood. Most people say that it actually operates like two organs, where the blood never mixes. So we'll talk about these two types of blood. So the left side brings in oxygenated blood, and in the right side, blood leaves as deoxygenated blood. So you can see that flow in our diagram. And both sides of the heart consist of two chambers, the atria and the ventricles. So now let's talk a little bit about the valves. So if you looked at that diagram back there, you could see that there at each little section there was kind of like a cutoff. So what valves do, if you could imagine like turning off a tap, it kind of stops blood from flowing to a certain part too fast or backtracking to another part where it would overflow with blood. So one set of valves is the atrioventricle valves. Or when we break it down into two valves, it's the mitral valve, or better known as the bicuspid valve, and the tricuspid valve. So the bicuspid valve is located between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The tricuspid valve is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Then if we look over to the other side, we have the semilunar valves, and this breaks down into the aortic and the pulmonary. So the aortic is located between the left ventricle and the aorta. The pulmonary are located between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. And you'll see this more when you start to draw the diagrams or when you look at diagrams where the actual location is. So now that we know all this stuff about blood and the heart, how does the blood actually circulate around our heart? Well, it does this through 3 different methods: pulmonary circulation, systemic circulation, and coronary circulation. So pulmonary circulation is when deoxygenated blood goes from the right side of the body to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries. In the lung, gas exchange happens to allow for fresh oxygen to enter the blood. And we'll learn a little bit more about gas exchange in our respiratory unit. Oxygenated blood flows from the lungs to the left side of the heart. For systemic circulation, oxygenated blood leaves the left side of the heart and takes oxygen to cells via the arteries. Deoxygenated blood leaves the cells and travels back to the heart via the veins. Blood then enters from the right side of the heart and then leaves through the lungs via pulmonary circulation. So those two kind of work hand in hand, pulmonary and systemic. And then lastly, we have coronary circulation, which is essentially the heart muscle is actually very thick and it requires its own blood supply. So it's sort of a branch off the aorta that supplies it to the heart muscle. So now we talked about all the different parts of the heart and how blood flows, but how does this blood get to different places? So I think you've heard me say the terms arteries, veins, and capillaries. So those are the 3 main types of blood vessels that we're going to learn about. So arteries travel away from the heart, and the way I remember that is arteries away. They both start with an A. And they usually carry oxygenated blood, for the one exception, which is the pulmonary artery, which carries deoxygenated blood. Veins travel towards the heart, and they usually carry deoxygenated blood. And again, the one exception is the pulmonary vein, which actually carries oxygenated blood. And then right in the middle, you can see that sort of web, which is the capillaries, which is the site of gas exchange. And that's something that we'll learn more about in our respiratory unit. Now we need to know about the heart cycles. So it kind of goes through 2 phases to sort of show that our heart is filling and contracting and how the blood actually enters and leaves our heart. So this is 2 phases, diastole and systole. So diastole is when the heart relaxes and it fills with the blood. So you can see that sort of at the beginning of the animation. Systole is the heart contracting, so getting really squished up and tight together, and the blood is pumped out to the arteries. The atria is the thing that contracts first. So you can see the blood sort of flows in and then is pumped right back out. And this happens lots of times in a minute. Especially it can be controlled by things like if you're an athlete, that can change it, or if you have some sort of problem with your heart, it can change it as well. And so when your heart is doing this or beating, it sort of makes a sound that we call a lub-dub sound, which is what you hear when you go to the doctors and they listen through a stethoscope. And the first sound is the AV valve. So if you remember those 2 valves that we talked about, the atrioventricular valves closing as blood fills the ventricles. The second sound is the semilunar valves close as blood leaves the heart. And we have to remember that those valves prevent the backflow of blood. So that's just a basic way of how you can describe the blood, how the heart fills with blood. So now that we have learned all this about the heart, we need to actually know what the circulation path of this blood in the heart is. So where it starts off is in the, oops, that's a big marker, in the superior vena cava. Then it moves to the right ventricle. It then goes to the pulmonary artery. It's then going to go this way to the lungs, or like the site of gas exchange, to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, to the aorta, and then out of the aorta into the rest of the body. And you can get a little bit more intense with this if you follow a more intricate diagram like we saw at the beginning of this slideshow, and you can see all the different parts that it goes through. But these are the main parts that you should know. And that's it. Thank you guys for listening.